Welcome to Hammond-Harwood House Museum, an 18th century architectural treasure in Annapolis, Maryland. Today on tour, we will explore the architecture, the people who lived here, and the museum's collection of fine and decorative art. The architecture of the Hammond-Harwood House is very unique for American architecture. It was built in 1774 for a young, wealthy gentleman named Tobias Hammond. It was designed by an English architect, William Buckland, who also worked across the street at the Chase Lloyd House. The house is modeled after an Italian villa, the Villa Pisani, that was designed by 16th century Italian architect Andrea Palladio. William Buckland carefully adapted the design to fit the climate and tastes of 18th century Maryland. This beautiful house contains some interesting architectural features, including semi-octagonal bays and a beautiful front door, often called the most beautiful door in America. President Thomas Jefferson sketched the Hammond-Harwood House in 1783 and later incorporated the bays into his own home, Monticello. The front door of the Hammond-Harwood House is often called the most beautiful doorway in America, and it is all hand-carved wood, designed after architect Abraham Swan's Book of Architecture. In 2018, the front door had a paint analysis done, and it was found that the original was cream-colored trim with a faux grain door made to look like mahogany. It has now been restored to its original appearance. The architect, William Buckland, passed away before the house was completed, and his apprentice, John Randall, saw it to completion. Matthias Hammond never ended up living in this house. He gave it to two nephews who also never lived here. The Pinckney family briefly lived here in the 18th century. Then the house was occupied by the Lockerman family from 1811 to 1924. The Lockermans had 10 children. The eldest, a daughter, Hester Ann, married William Harwood, and their children were the last family to occupy the house. The building then became a museum run by St. John's College from 1926 to 1940. It was then purchased by a private organization, the Hammond-Harwood House Association, in 1940, who has been running it as a museum ever since. The museum collection contains a great amount of early American art and furniture and depicts the era when the Lockerman family lived in the mansion in the early 1800s. Today, we will visit several rooms inside the mansion to see some beautiful artwork, architecture, and learn about daily life in the early 1800s. Our first room is our passage. Note the term passage rather than hall. It was a very important room at the time, setting the whole theme of social interaction for the household. Most visitors to a house of this economic class in the 18th century would see only this room. One's social class determined how far into the house one would be allowed. Social hierarchy was very important to the people of this very stratified society. One would find this area without much light because all the doors would be closed to this passage. A visitor would be asked to take one of these chairs that stand along the wall and wait to be seen by the owner. The passage was meant to impress the visitor. Note the very elaborate cornice and bold moldings over the doorways, which almost lean into the room. Pay attention to the moldings, cornices, and fireplaces throughout the house, since they vary depending on the intended use of the rooms. They are an important clue to social usage. In this space, there are paintings of Judge Jeremiah Townley Chase by Robert Edge Pine and his lovely wife, Hester Baldwin Chase by Charles Wilson Peale. This couple lived on King George Street in Annapolis. Judge Chase rented out the law office at the Hammond-Harwood House. In 1811, he saw an opportunity to purchase the entire property. He did not need a residence. However, he wanted his newly married eldest daughter, Frances Lockerman, to be close to him. In the case, notice the two miniatures of Frances and her husband, Richard Lockerman. Richard had his vices, like drinking and gambling, and his father-in-law, the judge, knew that. He bought the house for Frances and her family to live in, but kept it in his name rather than giving it to his son-in-law for fear he might gamble it away. The study was intended for the conduct of business, and the owner would have met with tradesmen and small plantation owners in this area. The very plain mantel, simple cornice, and lack of balance underscore the functionality of this room. Members of the household might have used this room to read, write, or sew, especially in warm weather when they would have moved away from the sunny garden side of the house. The desk/bookcase was made by John Shaw, the foremost cabinet maker working in Annapolis from the 1760s through 1820. A number of his pieces are in our collection, several of which are labeled like this one, which you can see in the middle of the back panel of the bookcase. Rembrandt Peale, son of famous American artist Charles Willson Peale, painted this equestrian portrait of George Washington. Rembrandt became obsessed with getting the perfect likeness of our first president. His paintings hang at Mount Vernon and the Baltimore Museum of Art, among others. Now this is our best bedchamber. Does it come as a surprise to find a bedchamber on the first floor of this house? It would not have to people of this period. It is important for us to remember that they were very, very different from us today. They did not think or act as we do. Research shows that many households in the 17th and 18th centuries had a bedchamber on the ground floor, either as a room for the master or mistress of the household, such as William Byrd of Westover, or as a room reserved for entertaining an important visitor, as done at Tuckahoe, the home of Jefferson's mother. This is a ceremonial room. Note the ornate cornice. It was used for entertaining and to display very expensive textiles used to dress the bedstead. The painting over the mantel is by Sir Godfrey Kneller. It is of Margaret Frances Townley Chase. She was the grandmother of Judge Chase, who bought this house for his daughter. Her family was English nobility, and the judge and his cousin Samuel Chase would use her family coat of arms on any custom-ordered silver or porcelain. The breakfast room, though rather small, is a fancy room. It has an elaborate cornice and a beautifully carved mantel, the second most ornate in the house. The room correlates to something between our living room and family room. It was assuredly a place where members of the household would gather daily for morning meals, with its excellent daylight, pleasing view of the garden, and its size allowing for easier heating. Families would gather in a small room like this for early morning breakfast. The morning meals were generally informal. Breakfast would be in the morning around 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Cold meats from the night before were generally served along with cheese, rolls, and butter. Plates would have been put on the sideboard, and as family members came, they could get one and take what they wished to eat. The wealthiest class of women, like Frances Lockerman, would have been able to enjoy leisure time. She would have ate breakfast with her family, cooked and served by her enslaved workers, then washed the delicate teacups herself to ensure their safety, then go visiting, check on dinner preparations, and then have an afternoon tea with friends. Frances's mother, father, and 3 younger unmarried sisters would have been frequent visitors to the home in the 18 teens and 20s. The growing Lockerman family would expand to have 7 living children, so this would have been a crowded, chaotic space in the morning. We know that Frances Lockerman had a recipe for good morning muffins that would have been served in the breakfast room. By contrast, the Lockermans' 5 enslaved workers who lived and worked on this property would have had a far different morning than Frances. We know some of their names, including Juliet and sisters Mary and Matilda Matthews. They would have risen 2 hours before the family and attended to the fire, made breakfast, and gotten started on an extensive list of chores, including laundry, emptying chamber pots, and polishing silver. Over the mantel, the painting called The Mill by Peale's brother, James Peale, and was owned by Charles Carroll of Carrollton. The dining room is the most important room on the first floor and served as the principal entertaining or reception room, what the English would have called the saloon from the French salon. Devoting a whole room just to eating was something done only by the elite. It had begun with the French, was borrowed by the English, and was of course copied by genteel colonials who wanted to emulate elite European lifestyles. The room features some of the most elaborate and important Rococo carving in America. Note the window casings and shutters. The Rococo, which dominated fashion before the Revolution, employed an enjoyment of natural forms: flowers, vines, leaves, birds' heads, and all carved in a very robust manner. This room is one of the very finest examples of this style found in pre-revolutionary America. Furthermore, the architect has truncated the usual central passage of a Georgian house and thereby expanded the dining room space to create an even more dramatic statement. However, Georgian symmetry is virtually unshakable, and thus we find the jib door preserving the central passageway through the house and providing an exit to the garden. In addition, there is a false door to the right of the fireplace to balance the door to the passage. It is one of three in the house. Over the slab top table is a copy of the Charles Wilson Peale portrait of William Buckland, which depicts the young man with his design for Hammond-Harwood House on the table, and St. Martin in the Field Church, London, behind him, serving to connect his work with that of great English architects. On the opposite wall are the Callahans, signed Peale portraits of William Buckland's daughter and her family. The dark-haired granddaughter grew up and married Richard Harwood. Their offspring were the Harwoods who lived in this house. The Harwood family pieces include the dining table, chairs, silver water urn, salt cellars, and the Callahan portraits. Now, in our stair passage, consider this staircase and the very ceremonial space it occupies. If you stand to one side or the other, you will note the fancy coined window, meaning the wooden blocks simulating stone that form the window on the exterior and its elaborate molding inside. Furthermore, the banister railing has been formed into a very graceful series of movements that is far more difficult to do than a simple railing, and the half rail echoes that motion. Also, please note the cove ceiling. This is a very unusual feature on an American house of this period. You'd find it in England, but not here. It's meant to give an impressive look to this stair passage. However, a strong possibility is that it would have been decorated with ornamental plasterwork, somewhat like an inverted wedding cake. And apparently, we surmise that with the Hammonds' political career over, the British blockade of the Chesapeake, and the collapse of fashionable living in Annapolis during the war, Hammond did not bother to have the workmen complete the decoration of the ceiling. Interesting to note is that there is one chimney in the center of the right side of the house and one in the center of the left side. Perfect balance again, but there is a fireplace in this bedchamber here and one in the game room. And the architect needed to get those flues to meet in the attic to get to that chimney. Hence, the flue from each fireplace meet in an arch and dictate this cove ceiling. Another important feature of this house is that this door here may be closed to the passage, as can the doors from each of these two rooms and the two below them, thus sealing off this section of the house from that larger 2/3. This is the family section of the house, as opposed to the entertaining section. And though these people were immensely wealthy, they were terribly practical. When not entertaining, there is no need to heat that part of the house, so just shut it off. Why then, you might ask, is this staircase so fancy? The reason is because the ballroom is located on the second floor. Now, this room in particular is called our study chamber, so called because it was the room over the study. It was a frequent practice in the 18th century to designate bedchambers by which room they were located above. There is an original Maryland bedstead owned by the Harwoods, blue color, not original to the Hammond-Harwood house, but was found in paint analysis of Chase Lloyd across the street. An original chest of drawers by John Shaw is also in this room. Meals, such as breakfast, were often taken in a bedchamber in the morning because it was already warm with a fire there. This was likely one of the Lockermans' children's bedrooms. In this period, it was quite common for multiple siblings to share a room. The north wing, now our visitors and exhibition gallery, also may have served as bedrooms for the children. Our upper passage provided a cool space, often used during warm months in the 18th century. One could sew by the window and watch who goes by in the street. Note the John Shaw linen press, an English form of furniture used for storing clothes. They did know about closets, but this was the fashion from England, and that held a lot of sway in southern colonies. Note the Charles Milbourne watercolor of Church Circle, dated 1794, which includes the State House, Maryland Inn, and St. Anne's Church. Try to see the tiny flag on top of the State House. Noted craftsman John Shaw of Annapolis made 2 early American flags. Until recently, no one knew exactly how the Shaw flag looked. Using technology to zoom up on the painting, a local vexillologist, the late Reverend Dick Libby, was able to show exactly how this flag looked. We now sell reproductions of this flag. Frances Townley Chase Lockerman referred to this room, her bedchamber, as her northeast turret. Note the samplers. Both are Maryland pieces and by young girls, ages 11 and 13. 2 women's work tables, both Harwood family pieces, one Philadelphia, and the smaller one attributed to Duncan Fife of New York. The Federal period was the first time in history that furniture specifically for women began to be produced, such as these work tables, which combined writing surfaces and sewing sections. Note the Charles Wilson Peale portrait of Anne Proctor and her doll, made in Baltimore in 1789. The doll and portrait remained in that family until the 1950s when they came to Hammond-Harwood House. Now, our game room is interpreted using early descriptions of the Annapolis assembly rooms, which describe the dances as occurring upstairs in a long ballroom terminating in a smaller room for playing cards. Cards were enormously popular and provided one of the few opportunities for women to mingle with men and operate on an independent and equal basis. Prints often show triumphant women beating men at card games. Chinese mother of pearl, fishes and counters, were for playing loo and quadrille. Sideboard tables were for serving punch. These portraits of the Pinckney family who lived here from 1806 to 1811, including Amelia Grayson Pinckney, who lived here with her husband, Ninian Sr., her son, Ninian Pinckney Jr., was born at Hammond-Harwood House in 1810 and is depicted with his wife, Mary Hambleton, by a Maryland artist, John Beale Bordley. The portraits of Amelia's brother-in-law, William Pinckney of Annapolis, attributed to Boucher, hangs above the fireplace. William was a famous early 19th century lawyer, statesman, and diplomat. The family loved poetry, and almost every member of the family had wrote some. Amelia and Ninian Sr.'s nephew, Edward Coote Pinckney, son of William, grew up to be an accomplished poet who even gained recognition from Edgar Allan Poe. The ballroom was a very large room, perfect for entertaining, located on the 2nd floor, which is out of the European courtly tradition of what the Italians call the piano nobile, the noble floor. Furniture was kept against the walls and brought out as needed, in this case, for a tea party during a musical. The room permitted dancing, which was enormously popular in 18th and 19th century parties. Think about the dining room directly below, and now look at the ornamentation of this room. The look is completely different. Gone are all those robust flowers and leaves. In particular, the plaster cornice now has these very low, flat Greek vases with fabric looped through their handles in elegant swags. This is a reflection of the neoclassical taste which was becoming fashionable in Europe following the archaeological discovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum. The neoclassical, often called the federal style, is generally not seen in this country until after the Revolution, usually the 1780s and 90s. But here it is at this early date, and clearly was a decision to go with the new fashion rather than the Rococo. Americans very much took to the neoclassical as a national style because they felt that we were recreating the democracies of ancient Greece and Rome. And so this serves as a political statement, one of the earliest known examples of the neoclassical in America. And it is clear that they didn't quite understand the fashion completely, as seen with the swagged flowers on the mantle, which are still very robust, deep, bas-reliefed carved flowers, typical of the earlier Rococo fashion. The room could have been used similarly to this image of a Boston party in 1821, depicted by Henry Sargent. This is now at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. The service wing of the house served as the heart of what made a large entertaining house like this work, with a kitchen here and a laundry and wash area in what is now the office. The open fireplace and brick floors permitted cooking many dishes at once. Hot coals were brought out in piles on the floor, and pots on legs were placed over the coals, thus giving a more controlled source of heat than that of cooking directly over the roaring central fire. It is important not to be charmed by this room. Life in the kitchen was hot, dirty, dangerous, and tiring. No oven exists in this house. City houses did not require the expense and heat of having bake ovens, since there was a municipal bakehouse where items for baking could be sent at a small charge or products were purchased at the bakery. The fortune of Matthias Hammond, the original owner of the Hammond-Harwood house, was built on the use of enslaved labor. He was born into incredible wealth and property, the son of Philip Hammond and Rachel Bryce Hammond. His first cousins were John Bryce Jr. and James. James built the opulent Bryce House on the corner of East and Prince George Street in Annapolis. A 1783 tax shows Hammond held 63 enslaved people and 3,400 acres of rural land around Maryland in addition to his 4 city lots. He never lived at the Hammond-Harwood house, but it is important to keep in mind that the home was funded by the profits enabled by the use of enslaved labor. Matthias Hammond's 2 nephews owned the property next and held slaves, but never occupied the home. The Pinckney family briefly lived here from 1806 to 1811, and it is thought they held 2 to 3 enslaved people. The Lockermans were the first family to live in the home permanently starting in 1811. The Lockermans had a country plantation and a city home, typical of a wealthy couple in the early 19th century. Richard Lockerman's inherited plantation was near Easton, Maryland, on the eastern shore of Maryland. It was called Bennett's Tolson. This image shows Lifford Landing, a plantation next door, and depicts what the Lockerman plantation could have looked like. The Lockermans' 2 households ran on enslaved labor. The plantation had a mix of about 20 male and female free and enslaved laborers who tended to crops and oversaw daily activities. The enslaved population at their city home, Hammond-Harwood House, was mainly female, and the inventory records show that at any given time in the early 19th century, there were as many as 5 enslaved women working here, and usually several children as well. An enslaved servant would have risen early and started a fire and cooked breakfast. On the grounds, the Lockermans had a vegetable garden, spring house for water, orchard, and outhouse that would have been tended by the enslaved women. During the day, they would have taken care of the children, emptied chamber pots, cleaned lamps, set out table settings for meals, and cleaned the furniture. Laundry was generally done once a week. Cooking was an ongoing task with a large family like the Lockermans. The kitchen would have served as a hub of activity for the enslaved population. On the other side of the fireplace in the next room was the laundry, and upstairs where the sleeping quarters were. The household used a community bake oven across the street at the Chase Lloyd House. The Lockermans' enslaved population was connected to the African American community in Annapolis through visiting the bake oven and shopping at the marketplace downtown. The museum is working to uncover their narratives, but we know some of the stories of free women, Mary, Matilda, and Juliet. A permanent exhibition has now been installed in the kitchen and service hyphen, which sheds light on their narratives. In 1811, David Bailey Warden, an American diplomat to Paris and author, wrote about his visit to Annapolis, stating, quote, "I am pleased with this city. It is beautifully situated on the banks of the Severn on a point of land which is almost surrounded with water. The town has a romantic appearance. The houses are thinly scattered over a considerable extent of surface, and intervening gardens and lawns give it a very rural aspect." End quote. The same year, the young Lockerman family moved into the stately mansion. During their residence, the estate included 4 acres with an orchard and vegetable garden. The Lockermans likely used their extensive grounds as a pleasure garden, similar to those seen in Regency England, like in Jane Austen's novels, for walks, outdoor picnics, and space for their children to play. It is probable that raspberries grew on the property for Francis Lockerman's beloved dessert, the raspberry fool from the British tradition. In 1825, Francis planted the boxwoods in the shape of a heart. Only the top remains. It is possible that the Lockermans buried their eldest son Townley in the garden when he died suddenly after slipping on the ice at age 8 in November 1812. No family plot existed at St. Anne's Cemetery yet, and home burials were not uncommon among the wealthy. Later generations of Harwoods were not as fortunate as those who came before them, and fell on hard times financially. The family sold off portions of the original 4 acres and let the garden grow wild. Contemporary illustrations of the late 19th century describe the home as a tangled garden. While no trace of the original structures of outbuildings exist, we know several were on the extensive property at one time. The Lockerman's granddaughter, Hester, was the last private owner when she died in 1924. And by that time, the garden was quite out of control and referred to by locals as the Tangled Garden. To earn extra income, she rented sections of the mansion out to local judges, Navy families, clothier, and an author. After the death of Hester Harwood, the contents of the home were auctioned off and the house was sold to St. John's College. The college ran a decorative arts program in the mansion ran by R.T. Halsey, who had a big hand in designing the American wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. However, due to strong personalities and the Great Depression, the venture folded. The Federated Garden Clubs of Maryland formed an offshoot, a private nonprofit known as the Hammond-Harwood House Association, founded in 1938. After a national fundraising campaign, the association purchased the mansion to run as a museum in 1940. Since 1940, the museum has been open to the public. The early founders of the museum were able to acquire a world-class collection of John Shaw furniture and paintings by the Peel family, as well as many original items. Today, the museum welcomes visitors from around the globe to delight in this architectural treasure, learn who lived here, and enjoy the fine and decorative arts collection. This concludes our tour of the Hammond-Harwood House. Thank you for visiting us.